Hey, it's time for TV Skywriter. Good evening, everybody. Welcome to TV Skywriter. I'm Pat Murray, your host. Ordinarily, you see me doing Bull City Notes. Of course, a motorcycle gang starts up their engines right now as I speak. That's okay. So tonight, I'm doing TV Skywriter. Very special guest today, the gentleman who wrote this great book, Becoming a Creative Genius Again. And we'll ask him what this again means. Mr. Carl Nordgren, a fellow Durhamite. Welcome to the show, sir.
Thank you very much, Patricia. I'm so excited to be here with you.
Very happy to see you. I was going to say meet you, but we actually met. You gave a free, it was like a class at the South Regional Library about creativity.
That's right.
And I totally loved it. And I love this book, by the way. Could I promote it even more? Yes.
Well, thank you. Thank you. Yes, we had a wonderful conversation when that workshop was over. I was delighted that you came up afterwards and that we got to meet each other. That was fun.
It was really great. But I have a question. Okay, we're going to talk about creativity.
Yes.
But here's what gets me. How is it possible that there's a person, obviously I'm talking about you, who has taught at Duke University but also had a job as a fishing guide? How is that even possible?
Well, I was so fortunate to have both opportunities. Each of those opportunities have really had a profound impact on my life and on the way that I look upon the topic of creativity. I was a fishing guide in Northwest Ontario a long time ago. Back in the mid to late 60s. It was my first job. It was the summers of high school and the summers of college. And it was a wonderful opportunity to work in Northwest Ontario with Ojibwe Indians at a fishing camp of most extraordinary nature. One of the concepts that I share with my students is the impact of the primacy effect. That which happens to you first in a new experience is going to have a disproportionate impact on how you look at that from now on. Well, my first job as a fishing guide had a profound impact on how I addressed work thereafter, for I had the wonderful good fortune of working for a gentleman, Barney Lamb, who understood, for instance, how to be generous with his guests, and that he was generous with his guests in the inches and the minutes of all the time that they spent at his camp. There was a fly-in fishing camp. You take a pontoon plane in and land on the English River and spend probably 3 or 4 days there at a time. And so you have a wonderful opportunity to really care for these guests. And his care was remarkable. And I saw that the more he cared, the more generous he was, the more generous his guests were back with him in response to him.
Interesting.
So I had a wonderful time working there, and it really shaped my view of entrepreneurship and creativity. And then 15 years ago, Duke asked me, after I'd had the opportunity to start a few companies here in the Triangle. I had a hand in starting the first cellular telephone company here back in the mid-'80s, for instance.
Oh, for real?
Yes. And so Duke asked me to come teach a class on startups, and I did that for a little while, but that class very quickly morphed into a class on how to be the most creative and the most entrepreneurial version of yourselves that you can be. And that really shaped my life, that the opportunity to teach that class to those students.
Interesting. I want you to give us an idea of what you mean by creativity. I think most of us have a notion, maybe. It seems that nowadays the importance is put on acquiring skills.
Yes.
But I'm wondering where creativity comes in, and if you could even define it first.
Okay. Well, I will not define it first, because one of the things I learned as I taught creativity to my students is that as soon as I define something for somebody, they think they know it. And as soon as they know it, as soon as I think they know it, they stop thinking for themselves about it. So instead, what I would do for my students, and of course, when you have them for a whole semester, you have the opportunity to do this, I would try to surround the concept of creativity so that they could shape their own understanding of what creativity might mean. But here's how I would enter into this by, first of all, making the point that we have mistaken for way too long the idea that you're only creative if you're artistic. And of course, that just isn't so. There's so many other expressions of creativity that go beyond an artistic expression of creativity. So one of my missions in life is to make sure that people understand that if they've been telling themselves the story that I'm not artistic and so I must not be creative, that they should, that's just not so, that's just not so. Some of the ways that I suggest to people they'll start to experience a growth of their creativity is if they can begin to see problems as opportunities. That's a creative perspective on the world.
Or give us an example of that.
Well, it happens in your life every day, right? Where instead of just simply stepping over that difficulty, instead of just simply saying to yourself, well, okay, I don't like to do this handoff within my organization. For me to complete my task and hand it to the next department is a really very unpleasant thing to do because there's this problematic event that occurs when I try to deal with another group of people within my organization. Well, rather than seeing that as a problem and addressing that as a problem and being frustrated because you bring the sense that that's a problem, instead look for the opportunity there. If it's a problem for you, it's likely a problem for somebody else as well. And so if you acknowledge to the other person that this is problematic for me, hey, can we improve the way that we've been interacting around this challenge? Then you have the opportunity to improve the challenge.
I can think of a real elementary example. Great. Okay, so suppose, you sleep heavy, and when the alarm goes off, you roll over, hit the clock, and it's really hard to get up, and you find yourself oversleeping all the time. Right. So you figure, I've got to solve this problem because if I'm late for work one more time, so you take your alarm clock and put it in the bathroom. So you have to get up to turn the darn thing off.
Nice. And now you're in the room where you've got.
And now you're up.
Now you're up and engaged in your life. That's a wonderful way to solve that problem and turn it into a creative solution for your life. What really has informed my work, Patricia, and what really, for a number of years, I was just delighted to have the opportunity to teach the topics of creativity and entrepreneurial behavior to students. And then I came across a research project, and this is the payoff of the title of the book when I talk about becoming a creative genius again. Back in the 60s, and I was a fellow who came of age during this, during that great space race between the Soviet Union and the United States, when, of course, the Soviet Union jumped out ahead of us by launching Sputnik. Every success in the space race initially was accomplished by the Soviet Union. Well, there, John F. Kennedy in the early 60s declared to the American public that by the end of the 60s, we were going to successfully send somebody to the moon and bring them back home safely again. Well, that was declared at a time where NASA, our space agency, had just failed a year or two before to launch a dumb satellite into space. But now they have to become the agency that's going to send somebody to the moon. And so they realized the magnitude of that challenge, and they came to a very important conclusion. They realized that they had to hire all of the most creative and entrepreneurial and innovative scientists and engineers that they could find. And so they created an assessment tool to measure those qualities of thinking, creative qualities and entrepreneurial qualities of thinking. And what they did when they had that assessment tool was a very smart thing. They first applied it to their current employees, to their existing employees, so they could calibrate it. So they could see that if, in fact, the most creative and innovative scientists and engineers that they already had employed, would they score the very best? And would those scientists and engineers from whom they only expected basic, day-to-day work, would they score the least effective on this creativity assessment? And NASA was delighted. They determined that this assessment calibrated perfectly, that the folks that they considered to be their creative geniuses scored by far the best. And it trickled down as they expected that it would. Well, when the researchers found how delighted NASA was with this research project, with this assessment tool, rather, they took it exactly as is. They didn't change a thing. They used it exactly the way NASA used it, and they applied it to 1,500 5-year-old school children. And I would just have loved to have been in that room when they began to tabulate the results of this assessment of these 1,500 5-year-old school children, because they would have seen that 98% of them, 98% of these school children scored as well as the very most creative, the very most innovative, what NASA had declared was creative genius. 98% of these 5-year-old school children scored.
Wow.
Well, the researchers, of course, follow that cohort until they're 14 and then measure them again, and 19 and then measure them again. And when they're 25 years old, these 1,500 kids, when they're 25 years old, only 2% of them score as creative.
So what happened?
Well, the researchers' conclusion is that they went to school, and that at school they were taught that there was one right answer, that there's only one way to get to that right answer. And so
yeah, show your work.
So you have to and narrow your thinking, right? Do it the way I tell you to do it. Don't think for yourself. Do it the way I tell you to do it. If you don't do it the way I tell you to do it, you'll be penalized. Perhaps you'll even be punished. And so the researchers concluded that we taught creativity out of them.
Wow.
I believe that the researchers were correct, but that they didn't go far enough. I think that they're in the 60s, 70s, 80s, until fairly recently, all of our institutions undervalued the importance of creativity. And so all of our institutions have had some role in telling us that we should worry less about our creative qualities and more about our rational and logical qualities, which of course are extraordinarily important, but they're going forward in this unknown future that we're all facing. They're just not enough. We now need to become creative geniuses again. And
okay, now
yes.
you have an advantage in that you're a parent. I'm not. Can you tell us whether things have changed? Because I have heard, at least as a journalist, I've been told that learning, kids in the classroom are being taught to work together, and come up with their own ideas and that sort of thing. Is this true across the board?
There's much more project-based learning. There's many more curriculum like Waldorf School that are play-based and nature-based and much more open-ended, where children are the key difference is we for way too long believed that children consume their educations. They don't. They need to produce their educations. They need to be in a position where they can construct new knowledge for themselves, which they're totally capable of doing. I mean, I watch 4-year-olds all the time take something that they learned over in this part of their life and something that they learned over in that part of their life and bring those understandings together to create a new understanding for themselves, right? So you really only truly learn when you construct this understanding for yourselves. So I have seen, again, I taught at Duke for 14 years. That meant I started to teach right around the year 2000. For the first 4 or 5 years that I taught at Duke, I had to work really hard to convince my students that what we were doing here was important. They walked in the door sort of skeptical about whether becoming creative was really going to be of value in their life. That was the first 4 or 5 years. But boy, something shifted. The last 10 years or so that I taught, I think the message, the message began to spool very effectively. The last 10 years that I taught, kids walked in the door, man, just eager. They had a clear understanding in their minds and in their hearts and in their souls that developing these creative capacities, developing these entrepreneurial instincts was going to serve them regardless of what they chose to do in their life. So yes, I think it is a message.
Well, let's get back to those first kids you taught, the first group, the first 4 or 5 years. Did they ever, throughout the semester, did their minds ever change about the importance of creativity? The first group?
Yes, absolutely. For most of them, it took about I would guess somewhere around the first 25% or so of the semester was me trying to sell the message, and me trying to sell the message again to students who were often hard sells. But usually about 25% of the way in, a significant percentage of them would begin to get the message. IBM helped me quite a bit, because at about this time, IBM came out with their own big research project where they surveyed 1,500 CEOs, same magic number, 1,500, in this case, 1,500 CEOs. And they asked these CEOs, what's the number one employee quality that you're looking for going forward in this future of unknowns? And much to everybody's surprise and my delight, the number one answer the CEOs came up with, 64% of them said the number one quality that they're looking for is creativity.
Really?
And so,
thank goodness.
And since Duke students are all about getting a job, I mean, they're very, very career oriented. If I could turn to them and say, hey, look, this is what the CEOs are looking for. CEOs are saying to themselves that we're looking for is creative leadership in their organization and all throughout the organization, that helped me make that sales pitch to my students happen even faster when that research was on my side.
I want to talk about you just a little bit, if you don't mind.
Okay.
When you were a kid, were you considered wildly creative?
When I was a kid, I was considered fairly creative. Yes, I was considered fairly creative. My creativity showed up in a way that didn't immediately look like creativity. I was in the woods all the time. I was in the woods all the time. And in the woods, when I was very young, in my mind, I was Tom Sawyer, or I was Huckleberry Finn, and there was a creek in these woods, and I was building rafts and floating rafts down the creek, and I was, excuse me, building forts. And so in that world, and that was one of my most creative expressions. But yes, in school, I've always wanted to be a writer. I'm delighted to have published some novels in the last few years of my, these most recent years. So I was a writer in school as well. So I guess that was one of my creative expressions. And I was always prepared to be a little different than all of my friends. I had a lot of very, very close friends, and I was a little bit of the oddball amongst my odd friends in many ways. So yes, I think I had a little bit of a reputation, at least a little bit of a reputation as the creative dude.
How has it best served you?
How has it best served me? Well, it certainly has served me well as a parent. It certainly has served me well as a parent. When I began to understand through my study of creativity how important concepts like open-endedness is, that you want to introduce ideas and concepts without defining where they need to go. A piece of research that's just so powerful about this is some researchers created, excuse me, I'm sorry, I'm just starting to I'm getting over a cold. Some researchers designed a ball-like object that could do 6 different things. It could whistle, it could buzz, it could bounce, it could light up, it could do 6 different things. Well, the researchers give that ball-like object to some 10-year-old children. One group of 10-year-old children, they tell them one of the things it can do. Now go explore and discover. The other children, they just simply give the ball to, and they don't say anything to them at all. They just simply give them the ball. Well, the kids that just get the ball with no directions, no instructions, they discover all of the things that the ball can do. The kids that are giving the ball and told, here's one of the things it can do, and now go find the other things, on average, they find like 4 of the things the ball can do. The more direction often that you're given, the more it restricts what you're trying to accomplish and what you're trying to discover. The more open-ended it is, the more likely you're to explore all of the options. And so that's my study of creativity and my understanding of human creativity has really served my daughters very, very well, because they found that I brought that open-ended exploration to our lives together, and that served them well. So that's certainly true. And then as
does that mean that you didn't? Does that mean that the boundaries that you set for them as a parent were less stringent, or you allowed your kids a little bit more freedom than maybe the average parent?
Yeah, I think we did, but there certainly were boundaries. Now, my wife, who's much more knowledgeable than I about early childhood development, if she was sitting here next to me, she would be agreeing with what I'm saying, but she would also want to have woven in there the importance that there are boundaries, right? There are boundaries. Children want to know some boundaries. They feel much more empowered and much more confident in themselves when they understand that there are strict boundaries around them. So there were certainly boundaries, but they weren't arbitrary, and they could be negotiated, and they were always changing as the children were changing. So they were dynamic, but they were certainly there. And then as an entrepreneur, I think one of the places creativity helped me the most as an entrepreneur, Patricia, is that I learned the power of story as an entrepreneur. And I began to address story not as I do in my novels, right, as this magical thing that carries us to other places, but I began to address story as a technology, as a knowledge management technology. And it is a marvelous knowledge management technology, because not only can a story encode information and directions for accomplishing something or organize information, but it brings meaning to that information. It brings context to those directions. And so that I not only learn specifics, but I learn these specifics in a contextual framework that allows me to act on it. And so when I was an entrepreneur, one of my main jobs was to find the story of what our company was up to that would be most meaningful to our employees, that would provide them with direction so they would understand why we're trying to accomplish what we're trying to accomplish, and that would be told to them through our stories. But then also the stories that we would tell to the marketplace about who we were was a big part of our promotional and marketing success. So being a storyteller as an entrepreneur, I think, is a very useful creative exercise, a very useful creative skill.
I love stories too. And in fact, I'm going to tell you two very quick stories that really, how can I put this? When you're young and you hear stories, very often they can help you find where you fit in, you know what I mean, to your family or the world or whatever. But it can also give you something to work with when it comes to tough times. I'm going to tell you about my niece. Jahan had a very difficult, how can I put it? She was a preemie. Let's just put it that way. She was an extreme preemie. When my mom and my dad, myself, went to see my sister and Jahan the first time, believe it or not, Jahan was so small with the tubes, you know, and it was sad. My mom said, well, your sister's young. Cookie she can always try again. In other words, we didn't think she was going to make it.
Right.
All throughout Jahan's childhood, she had me to tell that story to her over and over, and she loved that story. She was like her own superhero.
Oh, you know? Bet.
Yeah, so she loved that story. I loved it too. But she, of course, her mom couldn't tell her that story. She was out of it. She didn't know what my mom had said and how sad Jahan looked to us. And that provided Jahan with some fuel. She grew up with a lot of confidence. And I think a lot of it was because she knew that she made it through really, really challenging times, and she knew she could make it.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. So, what a wonderful touchstone for the, you know, for strength in your life. That's extraordinary. That's just extraordinary.
So and she right now, people her age go to her for answers a lot of times, and she's always been that way, wise and kind of reassuring, and I think it comes to the inner strength, you know.
That's wonderful.
And another story. Okay, my granddad, he grew up in extreme poverty in Augusta, Georgia, one of 9 kids, and he said very often they were so broke, whatever, they drank water for dinner. But he always told us school was of the utmost importance.
Yes.
So they went to school, they studied a bit, drank some water, filled up their stomachs with water, and then studied some more, went to bed, and went to school the next day. Wow. Same thing, day in, day out sometimes. And I realized going through poverty myself sometimes, you know, some of these adult times, you know, my life, knowing that my granddad survived drinking water for dinner lets me know, oh, I'm going to be okay, because I always have more than water.
Right. So, well, both of those stories are just such extraordinary stories of the power of the human spirit. To, you know, it's remarkable. It's the work that I do in helping people reclaim and restore their creative genius is so satisfying. But it's a source of such great optimism, because as you see those sorts of powerful human expressions all the time. Not to diminish any one of them, but we're remarkable in that regard, aren't we? We've got such capacity, and so few of us fully develop that capacity. Those are wonderful stories.
Well, thank you. Tell us what we can get out of your book, which is called, by the way, Becoming a Creative Genius Again.
Right. Well, since we are already born creative geniuses, since that quality exists in all of us, the book will tell you that restoring this genius is really rather simple. It's really rather simple. Now, I'm not saying it's easy, because it does take some will. It does take some intention. In fact, that's mostly what it does take, is some intention. The book makes the case that if you decide in your life that at this moment in your life, you're going to become the most creative and entrepreneurial version of yourself that you can be. And if that intention is authentic, if you mean it when you say it to yourself, you know, that little story that you're telling in your head all the time about who you are and what you're trying to accomplish in your life, if you begin to incorporate in that story a theme line that says, from this point forward, I'm going to be the most creative and the most entrepreneurial person I can possibly be, the great news is it begins to happen because those qualities are within you. And when you make that intentional declaration, there's something really very, very powerful about perspective, about how one views the world. And neuroscientists are increasingly clear that what we see, what we think we see, is really what our brain tells us that we've seen. But only 1/3000th of the data that enters your eyeball is actually what you see in your head. The rest is scrubbed out and replaced by memory, by status quo, by expectation, by what you expected.
Wow. That's amazing.
And that's just extraordinary, isn't it? It's just extraordinary. So what that means is that we don't see the world as it is. We see the world as we are. And so when you intentionally declare that from this point forward, you're going to be the most creative and entrepreneurial person you can be, that begins to influence the way you see the world. You begin to see the world as a creative and entrepreneurial person sees the world. Now, initially, that change in your perspective is likely to be incremental, right? It's not going to be transformative immediately. It's likely to be a small step in change initially. But notice I didn't say only incremental, because the increment itself can be so very powerful. If I see a problem just a little bit differently today than I saw it yesterday, if I see an opportunity just a little bit differently today than I saw it yesterday, that might be all it takes for me to see it in a new light, in a way that allows me now to come up with fresh solutions and come up with fresh development. So, you know, the great faiths, this is the power of intention is an ancient wisdom. The great faiths have all understood for a long, long, long time that when a new member comes into that faith community, of course we go through training, and of course we go through study, and of course we go through other disciplines. But at some point in that effort to bring somebody new into your faith, there has to be a moment of intentional declaration that from this point forward, I'm a member of this faith, because they know that from that point forward, you'll begin to see the world more consistently with the faith narrative.
Okay, that makes sense.
So one of the very first things I ask my students to do is to wrap their head around the idea that if they want to grow their creative and their entrepreneurial qualities, it's so simple. All they have to do is decide it's important. All they have to do is decide it's important, act on it by declaring to yourself, to your friends, the friends that will help hold you to this declaration, and then find some little things to work on, some little activities in your life that show that you're now doing things differently. One of the easiest creative hacks that I've ever found, Patricia, this is almost like magic. I'm so delighted to be able to share this. About halfway through my 14 years of teaching, I offered my students the assignment where they would form 3-person teams and go to the internet and find the most recent research that the neuroscientists are doing about what goes on in the brain when you're being creative, or what the social scientists are finding, what goes on in a community when you're being creative and entrepreneurial. Then they come in and make a presentation to the class. Well, that meant that for 7 years, I had hundreds and hundreds of research projects being presented to me. One that really I took a hold of is 4 years ago out of the University of Munich. Researchers created 4 different creative exercises, and they lay down the baseline score, right? We know how this works. They lay down the baseline score, and then the subsequent groups came in. One looked at the color blue for 30 seconds. Another looked at the color red for 30 seconds before they then take the test. One looked at the color orange. And the folks that looked at all those colors and then they take the creativity test, there's no change in their scores. The folks that stared at the color green for 30 seconds before they took the test had a 25% improvement in their creativity scores.
Wait a minute, what?
They stared at the color green for 30 seconds, and on average, they had a 25% improvement in their scores over a series of creativity exercises. So I went out that day and I bought myself a green folder, and I stuck it in my briefcase, and I bought one and put it next to my laptop, and 2 or 3 times a day I would take that green folder out and stare at it for 30 seconds. And now I've got a card that I pass out. In fact, on my website, people can download their own free creativity green card.
Oh, so that's why this comes with the book. Okay.
Comes with the book. That's right. It comes with the book as well.
Is there some kind of an explanation for that? It's
Well,
not magic, is it?
the
It can't be
researchers
magic.
are conservative, right? I would ask my Duke students, why do you think it was the color green? And somebody would say, oh, it's money. And I said, well, why do you think money is green? Or they would say the go light at a traffic light is green. I said, well, why is that? I said, just look out the window. Look at wherever you are in the world. If you look out the window, you'll see the color of growth is the color of green. And so that's my sense of it, is that you're just you're surrounded by growth. Those qualities within you become engaged. And so since there's also research that shows that out of Stanford, that when you reach your natural stride, when you're walking such that you're now fully walking, right, and you're in your natural stride, once again, your creativity improves dramatically because your brain gets integrated, right? Your brain really works together really nicely when you're walking. And so, hey,
you do point out the importance of walking. And
walking is vital.
Yes, I can vouch for that, because when I walk in the morning, I can come up with some really cool ideas.
Yes. Yep. And so now when you walk in the woods, you're not only getting the benefit of walking, but you're getting the benefit of being surrounded by all that wonderful green. And so I've always been, whenever I have a creative problem I'm dealing with, man, I take it to the woods. I just go for a 45-minute walk in the woods, and not every time, but most of the times, wow, I come back with often a couple of options to consider for that challenge.
I need to ask you this. Okay. For people who deal with children, it always used to bother me when teachers would correct students for coloring incorrectly.
Right.
And I even heard the horror of one of my coworkers who went to Korea and said that when he saw children's coloring books where on one side was the drawing that the child was supposed to color in, and on the right side was the correctly.
Oh my gosh.
Colored, so they could, copy the correct way of doing it.
Right.
But here's the thing. I have seen adults ask kids or tell kids, people aren't blue. Why did you make him blue?
Right.
And don't you think, again, I'm not a parent, so I'm just clutching at straws here. But wouldn't it be cooler if you ask the child, why is the person blue? Because you might get a good story.
You might get a great story. I've heard a story. I don't know if this is true or not, but I've heard this one from a couple of different sources about a 4-year-old girl that had been assigned, or maybe 5-year-old girl in kindergarten, that was told by her teacher to draw a picture. And so she's working on her picture, and the teacher's walking around the classroom checking on the different pictures that the kids are drawing. And when the teacher comes to the little girl's desk, the teacher says, "What are you drawing?" And she says, "I'm drawing a picture." The little girl says, "I'm drawing a picture of God." The teacher says, "A picture of God? Nobody knows what God looks like." And the little girl says, "Well, they haven't seen my drawing yet."
I love it.
That's children.
Wow.
That's children. There was a little 4-year-old girl running through my backyard with some other children just the other day. My wife has a preschool in the backyard, and she had on gossamer wings on her wrists. And as she was running, she was flapping her wings. And so I said to this young lady, I made the conventional mistake because I limited her choices. I said to this young lady, "Are you an angel or are you a fairy?" And without skipping a beat, Patricia, she said to me, "I'm a fairy named Angel."
Oh, there you go.
Isn't that wonderful? That's a 4-year-old child sensibility. That's a 4-year-old child sensibility, right? Not to be limited, but to embrace all of the options,
Nice. I want to tell another childhood story, but I want to ask you about adulthood and being the boss over a bunch of young people or employees or whatnot. I have noticed in Chicago, where I'm from, it's my hometown, very often, now again, this is a city of millions, which means there's a lot of rules, a lot of anyway, let me just continue with the story. When you're in a store, very often, if there's a problem, very often it doesn't get solved. The lowest person on the totem pole, you can imagine, would be the cashier. And very often the cashier, if they can't get to the boss or they can't get the boss's attention or the boss isn't in, they simply don't know what to do. Things don't get solved and everybody's frustrated all around. Now, after moving here to Durham, I've been really struck. I don't know why the culture is different here, but I have noticed if there's a problem, this doesn't happen every time, but very often, if there's a problem at a fast food chain, at a retail store, whatever, for some reason, it seems that the employees are given more leeway and they come up with creative solutions on their own. That shocks me every time.
Right. Right. Well, that's wonderful. That's wonderful. Those employees are very fortunate. Excuse me, very fortunate to work in an organization that recognizes that that's where decisions need to be made. Mm-hmm. Right? Decisions need to be made by the people who are dealing with the problem, dealing with the customer in the moment.
But that's creativity, right?
That's absolutely creativity. That's absolutely creativity. One of the ways I'll talk to business people, I said, if you have employees, if it's good for you, for your employees to make independent decisions, then it's good for you to be investing in developing the creative qualities of your employees, because they'll just keep making better decisions when they understand, for instance, the wonderful creative quality of humility, right? Of having the creative courage of acknowledging that you don't know, right? But that you are prepared to learn, right? What a wonderful creative quality that is. And so when you find people who are solving problems at the front line who are saying, oh, okay, well, we'll figure out how to solve that with you. What a wonderful creative expression that is. And don't you feel very, very close to that organization, right? You feel respected by an organization that can approach the problem with you in a humble fashion rather than in an insistent fashion, right? That they know now how they're going to solve this problem and that you've got to adapt to the way I'm now going to solve this problem. Or again, the one that the creative quality that I love to come back to time and again, Patricia, is the quality of being generous. When I had my cellular telephone company here, to remind some of your younger audience members, cellular started out in the mid 80s as a local market business. There were hundreds and hundreds of cellular telephone companies. Every market had two.
In the 1980s?
In 1985 is when we launched the cellular telephone company here in the Triangle, September 1985. And at that point in time, cellular was just barely a year old in some of the biggest cities like Chicago and in New York. So it was really very much a mid-'80s phenomena. And so when we launched our cellular telephone company, our determination was that we were going to be generous with the marketplace. Every time we had the opportunity to provide them with more value, we were going to do it. When we took that point of view, because we were a little bit, a little bitty company competing against Sprint, a company that had so much more money than we had, and so much telephone experience than we had. We were newcomers to the telecommunications industry. And so we just decided that the more generous that we could be with the marketplace, that we would turn that into a strategic advantage. And it was. What we found is that when we were generous with the market, they were generous with us. And so after the end of our first year, here's an example, and this is a little esoteric, but it's a powerful example if I can make it clear. In those earliest days of cellular, the billing companies, the companies that would create a customer's bill, they were startups as well. They were new companies. There wasn't a need for that kind of service before cellular came along. Well, initially they were not able to bill a customer of ours in real time. They instead asked that we would round up the bill in 5 or 10 or 30-second increments. So that your call that lasted a minute and 1 second couldn't be billed at a minute and 1 second because of billing company limitations. Instead, it had to be billed in the next increment. Well, the cellular industry, by the time we came along, had already decided collectively that they were going to do full minute incremental billing. So that 1 minute, 1 second phone call, you would be charged for 2 full minutes. We found a billing company that couldn't do real time, but they could do 10-second increments. And so that 1 minute, 1 second phone call on our system would be 1 minute and 10 seconds of billing time for our customers. So that's how we were being generous with them. We were trying to charge them only as close as we could to that value that they accomplished from us. Well, at the end of our first year, between us versus Sprint, we had a 68% market share. The market was generous with us because we were generous with the marketplace. So that's a quality. Back to your observation about frontline employees being able to make decisions and make things happen when they bring a generous attitude to the moment of trying to solve your problem. Isn't that a wonderful thing to behold? Don't you feel generous in return to that company when they've treated you in a generous fashion?
Okay.
To be generous.
I like that phrase you used earlier. You said creativity hack.
Yes.
So these are tough times for a lot of people.
Yes.
People are starting to realize that the average 9-to-5 job is hard to come by for some people, and that maybe entrepreneurialism is something they might want to look into.
Right.
Or maybe people can figure out how to keep their jobs by being more entrepreneurial on the job.
Right.
So if you could give us a couple of hacks.
Okay. Well, the first thing I'd want to do is to once again comment on how confident people should be. There's research that shows that the more confident you are in your ability to grow your creative and your entrepreneurial qualities, the more likely you will be successful doing so. So one of the ways I try to bring confidence into people's lives is by bringing up this research about the fact that 98% of us are born with a creative genius. But another evidence of how naturally creative we are that's probably more relevant to the question that you're asking. Outside the developed nations, in what we call the developing world, about 75% of all employment is self-generated. 75% of all employment is self-generated. An individual looks into her community or looks into his village and sees a problem, sees an opportunity, and realizes that they can solve that problem or they can cultivate that opportunity sufficiently such that they can earn a livelihood for their family. And so again, further evidence, those folks in the developing country that are making their successes happen with their entrepreneurial qualities, they're not educated, they don't have capital, they're doing it clearly through the qualities that they're born with, these natural, creative, and entrepreneurial qualities. And so that's something that I think we increasingly need to be embracing. And one of the ways I talk about it, and that I hope is helpful for people, and that is that they should not be looking these days, Patricia, for the path. The paths are gone, right? The paths are gone. I tell my Duke students all the time that it makes sense that you would consider life through the metaphor of a path, because when you're a senior at Duke University, you've been really well served by the straightest and most well-defined path that the world is ever going to provide you with. But you're at the end of that path, right? Now you're at the end of that path. And if you're looking forward, you are looking for the path, you're doing yourself a disservice because there's fewer and fewer and fewer paths all the time. Instead, the attitude that one should have is that from this point forward, I'm making my way. I'm responsible for making my way. To live the life that I want to live, and I have to construct it, right? I have to be the constructor of my life. From now on, I'm making my way. And so I'm sensitive now to the fact that there's a whole lot of boomers like me who, I couldn't go out and find a job right now. There's not anybody who would hire a 66-year-old guy with my life experiences. So I need to make my way. And there's a whole lot of boomers out there right now, right, who are finding that they were leaning to the left when their company took a hard turn to the right. So they get offloaded, they get set aside, they get made redundant. And now they are in their 50s and in their 60s. And boy, these are folks who now need to learn how to take those wonderful life experiences that they've gotten over the last 3 or 4 decades,
right,
and learn now to make their way, right, to look in their community, to find an opportunity that they can cultivate, an opportunity not that they can take advantage of, but an opportunity that they can create advantage around for themselves and for their family. And I keep bringing it back to just bring a little self-discipline into your life and keep working on these creative and entrepreneurial qualities. Just keep developing.
I say carry a notebook, because how many times have you heard somebody say, I wish somebody would do so and so,
Right.
which means they've already come up with a solution,
Right.
but
Yeah.
there's nobody doing it.
Carrying a notebook is a great idea for a whole lot of reasons. One, and I
Or
would,
your smartphone. That's right. Use an app on your smartphone.
but no. The research says don't use the app on your smartphone. The
Oh,
research shows that when you actually have a pen in your hand and you're writing it out, that you are so much more engaged in
oh,
your thought
really?
processes are so much more engaged if you have a pen. First of all, if you have anything in your hand, anything in your hand awakens your creative capacity. If I were to ask
Okay.
you, if I were to show you a pen on a table and you were to stand a foot away from that pen and I said, hey, come up with creative solutions, creative uses rather for that pen, you come up with a certain number. If I put that pen in your hand and asked you that same question, you'd have twice the number of responses and they would be much more original and much more creative than just
I
simply
got you.
sharing. So so what I say to my students, because they're required to keep a creative journal, I said it takes one understanding of an idea to hold it in your head. It takes a different understanding of the idea to be able to write it down.
Okay.
And then I urge them to make their journals really very visual, to not just write it down, but to try to visually represent your idea, to graph it, to chart it, to doodle it, to draw it, because that takes a whole nother understanding of your idea, right? To be able to visually represent it. And that's what you want to do with your ideas, is surround them and so that you understand them as best you can. And then
Okay.
the other little thing is that there's just that little bit of action, right? That when you're writing something, and creativity's got to be action oriented. You've got to be biased for action. And so, no, I would not let my students ever keep their journals digitally. I would make sure my students put away their laptops and
Wow.
their smartphones when they came into class. I said we're gonna be old school in terms of technology because because there's just way too much research that shows that if you are more physically engaged in the world around you, your creative quality is really awakened. It's really awake. You have
Wow.
intelligence all throughout your body, and it tends to restrict it when you're digitally communicating, but it tends to
That's
open
interesting.
when you're communicating all other ways.
I'm going to tell you a story about this guy I know. He has a company called Philco. And I hope he doesn't mind my talking about him, but he happened to have told me his origin story. Here's the thing. I can't remember what job he had, but he used to work somewhere here in the Triangle. All right. He had this job, whatever the heck it was, but he noticed that the company was throwing certain items away. And being into recycling, he asked the boss, can I take this junk you're throwing out and recycle it? And his boss said, sure, whatever. And so on the side, he started recycling. Time passes, time passes, time passes. The company eventually goes out of business, as so many do. And Philco is off on its own, still existing today here in Durham. And what he does, Philip, he collects stuff that people don't want, and he gets them to people who create new items from them. So he has a
Awesome.
recycling company,
Awesome.
which I thought was super awesome. So he's looking out the window at his job, seeing an opportunity.
Yes.
And he thought he was going to make a few extra bucks. It became his future.
That's marvelous. Well, that's a wonderful story that pays off your question to me earlier, where you said, give us an example of somebody turning a problem into an opportunity. There's a wonderful example of turning other people's problems, right, of disposing of this garbage into an opportunity. I'll take it off your hands and make it, come alive again. That's a wonderful story. Philco,
Right.
I'm going to keep my eye out for that company. That's a great story.
So I want us to be more creative, but also for those of us who have kids, with your being a parent, I suppose you could give us some more hints. But one thing I wanted to point out, you wanted me to tell people this story that I told you when we talked on the phone today, and I'll just tell it real quick.
Okay.
I was talking about how I've noticed when watching documentaries and watching lots of videos and stuff, it seems that the hallmark of being a parent for a lot of white people, I'm not saying blacks don't want to do this, but I see whites doing it, and it seems to be something that religious white folks like to do, and that is, and it's not a criticism, homeschooling their kids.
Right.
And I was saying how I can understand how that's wonderful to educate your own child. That sounds like a monumental task, a task that must be wonderful, and the family coming together, etc. However, it doesn't always allow for outside ideas to enter the child's mind.
Right.
Depending on the family, depending on why you want to homeschool. There's
Right.
many different reasons. And I was telling you how when we were really little, we had a babysitter who always wore a headscarf. And I always noticed this, and I asked one day why she wore the headscarf. And she explained to me that it was because of her religion, and that in her religion, they don't, I asked her what the religion was. She said they don't believe in Jesus. And I was like, really? And then later, I asked my parents about it, and they explained to me, yeah, they said it's true. They said, not everybody believes in Jesus. They say most religions, they try to teach you to be a good person and to do your best, et cetera, but not everyone believes in Jesus. And I was like, oh, that's interesting. And that allowed me as an adult to not fly off the handle or be so judgmental
Right.
when I see people of other faiths. And I think that's really important. I think what my parents taught me
Yes.
was that there's more than one way to be a good person, basically.
Absolutely. Well, and I'd like to think that my moral and ethical compass is such that I appreciate the importance of diversity for moral and ethical reasons. And I can also argue for the importance of diversity from a creative perspective. Research
riff a little on that idea about diversity.
Time again, research shows that the more diverse the group is, the more likely they will come up with original solutions. If we are a homogeneous group who have got mostly shared experiences, and now we're looking at this problem, we're going to look at it from our entrenched shared status quo, right? But if we have a great diversity within our group, not only do we have the benefit of multiple perspectives, which is an important benefit, but we also have the benefit of multiply diverse networks of people around us, so that now that we've come up with the best solution for the problem, and now it's time to execute, well, if you and I have all the same friends and same suppliers and same vendors and resources, then we don't really replicate it. We're not really enhancing each other. But if your if your network is remarkably different from my network and remarkably different from somebody else's network of friends and associates, boy, now it's time to get this problem into a product. And we've got all this much more diverse group of folks who can work on this with us and come up with different technological solutions, right? If we're all taught how to paint the same picture with the same paintbrush, then we're always going to get the same picture. But if each one of us is taught how to paint a little bit differently with different tools and different resources, then when we come together to work creatively, we've got all those different creative expressions that we can bring to bear on our challenge. So diversity has powerful importance in how a creative team should be formed, right? That team should really be formed with not with a mindfulness to diversity, because the corporation thinks that's a healthier corporate world. Well, yes, let's also celebrate that. But it's also just in their self-interest to have a very diverse group of people working on a problem, because it's much more likely that the best creative solution will be discovered when there's diverse perspective.
Do you think we'll ever come to a time where the concept of more than one right answer will be the way that we go? Because here's why I ask this. My mom was a teacher. It's not common, at least back when I was a kid, for schools to be integrated, but she happened to teach at an integrated school, and in high school teacher. And the white students were told by the administration that if a Black teacher started talking about that Black stuff, in other words, anything having to do with Black history, they had the right to walk out of the class.
Wow.
And
when would this have been historically? When was this roughly?
Mom was, let's see, this was in the 70s.
Wow.
Yeah.
Just yesterday.
And she was a music teacher. But here's the thing. I can imagine a day when you can learn history, and if there's Native American kids in the class, that you look at it from their point of view to see how it must look to them and ask them,
Yes.
And then, of course, being a Chicagoan, most of the white people I knew were what they would call ethnic whites, and
Right.
really weren't in the country. They were all all the white people I knew were second generation American. But still, to see it from different points of view, white, African American, Hispanic,
Yes.
Native. In other words, the one of the problems that we're having is that we see things from our very personal, ethnically speaking, point of view, or religiously or politically. But if we were able to see things from another person's point of view and get the point as to why they see it that way, then I think we could be more creative, perhaps.
Absolutely. Absolutely. A couple of
thoughts. Instead of saying we're not going to teach the black stuff, as they said at Morgan Park High School. Yes, right. I'm calling them out. I hope they've grown since then. But instead of leaving things out because it's irritating to hear,
right?
I think we'd all be more creative if we got to hear different points of view if they were explained in measured tones.
Yes. Yes.
As opposed to shouting at each other.
Absolutely. Absolutely. A couple of thoughts come to mind on that, Patricia. One is, I think it's a quote from the author F. Scott Fitzgerald. This won't be an exact quote, but I think I'm fairly close, when he said that the sign of an intelligent person is the ability to hold two conflicting ideas in your head at the same time and still act. Right? So yes, we shouldn't rush to say, okay, you've got one view, I've got one view, and now we're going to have to compromise, or now we're going to have to just select just one of them. No, let's not. Let's live with both of those views. Let's live with both of those views and see what happens. That's one thought that comes to mind. I think that's a strong reinforcement of what you're saying. The other maybe is a little bit of a side riff, and that is that my experience, and it's borne out by research, is that those people who are beginning a project, a new creative project, whether it's starting a company or a great big new initiative within a company, when they're starting a creative project, it tends to be our default position that the first thing that we do is we predict what it is we're going to do. We predict what it is we're going to do because why? Because we have to have a plan. And we have to have a plan, why? Because we have to have a budget, right? So that means that at the point in time where we're most ignorant about what it is that we could do, we're predicting what we will do. But instead, what experienced creative professionals and experienced entrepreneurs understand is that no, you don't predict what you're going to do. Instead, you discover what it is you should do. And so rather than beginning with the plan, you begin with action. You begin by getting out into the market or getting out into the environment where this idea is going to be cultivated and developed, and discover what it is people want, and listen to what people are looking to have accomplished, and being opportunistic. And so that comes to my mind as you also talk about this multiplicity, right, of viewpoints. When you're in a discovery process, it serves you so very, very well to hold on to a multiplicity of viewpoints for as long as you can, because you don't know which one of those viewpoints is going to be the one that's going to lead you to the most successful discovery. So to hold lots of, Steve Jobs, when Steve Jobs was asked about what's creativity, Jobs said creativity is connecting the dots. So make sure you have lots and lots of dots.
Gotcha. Right? After hearing you explain that, now I understand really clearly why you say in the book, ready, fire, aim.
Right. That's right. Get started. Because the minute you get started, you get smarter. The minute you get started, you get smarter. And one of the ways you get smarter is by not realizing or not worrying if the very first things you do are going to pay off the way you hoped that they would, because they may not pay off the way that you hoped that they would, but maybe they'll pay off in a way that you hadn't anticipated that you're going to be well served. But the primary thing is you've gotten started, you've got momentum, right? A body at rest tends to stay at rest. A body in motion tends to stay in motion. And so let's be that basic with our creative exploration, right? Let's understand that the minute we're moving, again, look at the 4-year-old creative genius, right? These geniuses that exist at the age of 4 and 5, when they come across a new challenge, they don't stand back and say, oh, I wonder what I'm going to do about that. They just get started, right? They step forward and they touch it and they pull it and they turn it, because they know the minute they begin to get engaged with it, they're going to be so much smarter about what is it that they could do with it, right? So they don't stand back and study it.
Isn't it amazing how they do that, though?
Oh, and they don't even, it's just natural. It just comes to them as a natural instinct is to step forward and touch it and turn it and open it up. And now I know more about it, and now I'll be able to figure out how I really want to use this thing. So, boy, a bias for action is vital, is vital.
Well, I really hope that we can become more creative in everything that we do. When I was taking piano lessons as a kid, I was taking classical piano, and it frustrated me that everything's written out, the notes,
right,
how softly to play,
right,
whether you're playing them with short bursts or smoothly, but every single nuance of playing the music is written down, and
right.
you have to do it that way. And I was thinking, maybe it might be good to start out with classical and get, at least the basics down, and then get into jazz.
Right, right.
And just,
I think it's good to learn some rules, right? It's good to learn some rules to get some discipline, and then you want to begin to break them as soon as you can break them. But I think the discipline of learning creative rules, artistic rules, I think that serves the creative process.
Mm-hmm. Well, give us one more hack before we go.
One more hack?
But one thing I want you to repeat. I'll repeat it for you. I don't mind. The staring into green, it sounds so wild.
Isn't that crazy? That's crazy.
It's so awesome.
Everywhere I go, I pass out these green cards. My goal is to turn the whole world green.
You have given us a whole new definition for the term green card.
So I stare at it 2 or 3 times a day. But then when I'm going to sit down and do something creative, right, when I have to write something or actually work on something creative, most of the time, I confess I'm not 100%, but I would say 70-80% of the time, I'll take my green card out and stare at it for 30 seconds first. So here's one more creative. The creative hack that I want to give you that's the broadest of all is that the common denominator amongst so much of this research is that when you want to get into your maximum creative state and stay there as long as you possibly can, a good way to think about that is you want to get out of your mind. You want to get out of your status quo mind, the mind that you look at, the mind that you use to look at the world day in and day out, the mind that you use to navigate your day. I mean, let's face it, the status quo serves us so very well through most of the day, right? If we had to make a fresh decision for everything that we do all day long, we'd be exhausted by noon. We'd be sleeping all afternoon. So the status quo serves us so well that we get captured by it. So even if you're a creative person, even if you believe that you are a creative person, you still have to get out of that status quo mind if you want to take a fresh look at something. So much of the research is about how to get out of your status quo mind, which is to say this executive control, right? This logical, conscious mind, you have to distract it. You have to deflect it. You have to give it a misdirection so that your subconscious creative mind can come to the fore and can express itself more easily. And so here are some of the things that researchers tell you can do to get out of your status quo mind. And the first one I'll tell you, my Duke students used to love this first one: drink a beer. A beer for most of us is just the right amount of alcohol to relax our executive control enough that we're not getting crazy, but we're relaxing it enough that our creative expression can make itself apparent. And so
that advice is for adults only.
That advice is for adults only. Absolutely, absolutely.
So what if you're a teetotaler or a youngster?
So then you can't take care of that, allow yourself the advantage from that one. But here's another one. Listen to sad music.
Sad music?
Sad music. All my life, my friends and family have wondered why I listen to so much melancholic music. Then I came about 5 years ago across the research project that shows that a group that listens to happy music has a little bit of a lift to their creativity scores. the group that listens to melancholic music has a major lift to their creativity scores when they take tests immediately after. The researchers have no theory as to why. No theory as to why. Another is dim the lights in your room. Bright light interferes with your creative processing. A dim light wakens your creative processing. One of the ones that I do at the beginning of my workshops these days is I have everybody stand up. But we've got this idea that our right hemisphere is our creative hemisphere and our left hemisphere is our rational and logical hemisphere. And there's a little bit of truth to that, but really what you want is an integrated mind. What you really want is both hemispheres working together, really working together. And of course, our right hemisphere controls the left side of our body. Our left hemisphere controls the right side. So there's research that shows that if you, before you sit down to work on a creative project, if you cross this meridian plane, right, cross the line that bisects your body, take your right hand, and tap out a little bead on your left shoulder. Take your left hand, and tap out a little bead on your right shoulder. You're crossing the meridian, you're integrating your brain, you're awakening your brain, and it's now more prepared to engage in creative cognition. So there's a couple of quick creative hacks.
I like that.
Again, these things are really very simple. All one has to do is decide that they want to be the most creative and entrepreneurial version of themselves that they can be, and just integrate a couple of these creative hacks into your life every day. And you'll find, I found that the significant majority of my students went through major growth over the course of a semester, major growth, and that the common denominator was they decided to be that it was going to be important to them. If they decided it was going to be. Yes.
Now it's never too late, is it? Because some people are probably watching or watch the replay saying, I've been structured all my life.
Right.
I have a PhD. I mean, I'm in a technical world. I don't have time to be creative. Do I really need this? Or maybe someone who is newly retired or someone going through a rough patch might say, well, maybe I need to be newly creative, but I'm in my 60s already. Is it too late?
It's never too late. It's never too late. And here's two answers to that. One that I've known for a while, one I just learned very, very recently. And that is that when I was 20 years old, the neuroscientists told us that our brains were as good as they were ever going to be. They were complete at the age of 20. They would only deteriorate from now on. What the neuroscientists now know is that our brains are much more like muscles than we ever thought that they were. And how you use, and when you use it to a particular purpose, it wants to be better and better and better for that particular purpose. The neuroscientists say that which fires together wires together. If you use your brain over and over again at a particular task, you will change the biology of your brain. And so that's one bit of evidence that it's not too late. I've just recently seen some research that I need to read more about that shows that people in their 80s go through another nice little creative spurt. Part of the theory is that I think we probably have some sense that the older folks get, the less they worry about executive control, right? The more that they're just out there, the more they just express themselves, the more they become, in some ways, the real them again after denying that for so much of their adult life because they've kept themselves under the wraps, right?
The get off my lawn stage.
Yeah, right. There's some evidence that they're in the mid-80s. Our executive control begins to relax again, and this creative expression returns. So it's never too late. It is never too late. It is never too late. I'm determined to maintain my creative expressions till the end. It's never too late.
I love this is great. And Carl, thank you so much. I'm going to take the green card wherever I go.
Great.
And it says here, folks, when you get the book, you'll get the card, right? And it says, to boost creative performance, stare at this green card for 30 seconds.
That's right. And of course, I hope people buy the book, but just to remind folks as well that if they go to my website, they'll find a free green card that they can download from the website as well. So be green. Be green.
Love that. And I will have that link in the description below if you're watching this on YouTube later. So thank you so much, Carl, for being on the show.
Look forward to seeing you again soon.
Absolutely. So folks, talking to Carl Nordgren, this is his book, Becoming a Creative Genius. Again. Wonderful, wonderful book. So we will talk again, Carl. This is not your only time being on TV Skywriter. Just your first.
And I look forward to a cup of coffee soon as well.
Wonderful. Okay, folks, you know what to do. Be creative and be sure to read Durham, North Carolina's online community paper, Durham Skywriter at durhamskywriter.com. If you would like to be a guest, you don't have to be in or from Durham. I've talked to people from literally around the world. Just hit me up on Twitter at Durham Skywriter. With that, have a beautiful evening or day. I will see you later. Ciao for now.
Thank you, Patricia.